Tourists, government officials, and ordinary Russians were all witness to a unique sight on Moscow's Red Square on November 10, 2013. 29-year-old performance artist Pyotr Pavlinsky positioned himself away from police in front of Lenin's tomb, quickly pulled off his long coat and loose pants, and sat down naked on the cobblestones. He then drove a nail through his scrotum, attaching himself to the street. As Slate reports on November 11, 2013, this act, called fixation, was equally grotesque and powerful. Police quickly surrounded him and covered him up with blankets, because no one had the courage to pull out the nail, he later told The Guardian on November 15th. He was then taken to the nearest hospital, where he received a few stitches, a tetanus shot, and a brief mental health examination. He was declared sane. Just a few days later, Pavlinsky joined several other political activists in jail. He was charged with hooliganism. This act was Pavlinsky's latest in a series of 3 defiant, self-mutilating protests against the Russian government. In all of these acts, Pavlinsky is challenging Russia's police state and is hoping to create a dialogue on political freedom. Given that these acts may create even more negative attention for Russia, much like the jailing of Pussy Riot, we must ask today's question. How can performance art, as exemplified by Pavlinsky's self-mutilation, be used to counter repression and create a space for dialogue? To answer this question, we will turn to the model, a 3-dimensional perspective on the cultural interpretation of protest performances, the case of protest poetry in Israel during the Second Intifada. This model is ideal for analysis because it shows how protest performances can be a vehicle for cultural criticism. So, in order to gain a deeper understanding of these communicative techniques used by Pavlinsky, we will first discuss the model, apply it to his performances, and draw some critical implications. In their model, authors Monty Niger and Ayelet Cohen analyzed the protest performances of Aaron Shabtai. Shabtai wrote protest poetry that was critical of the violence between Israel and Palestine in the early 2000s. They argue successful protest performances have 3 dimensions that create a persuasive cultural argument. Those 3 dimensions are the diachronic dimension, the synchronic dimension, and the time-space aspect. First, the diachronic dimension. This dimension focuses on history, as a current protest performance should reference previous protest performances at critical times in a culture's history. Shabtai accomplished this by referencing previous protest poetry written in Israel during the 1982 Lebanon War. It borrowed their scripture-like style and format and used the same symbols and tones, essentially placing his poetry in a historical context. Second, the synchronic dimension. As the authors explain, this is the political dimension of the artifact, as a current protest performance must establish a connection between themselves and the ongoing political event, with the intent of creating a response from their audience. Shabtai did this by taking actual news events and turning them into poetry. One of his poems, My Heart, told the tale of Israeli soldiers who broke into Palestinian homes and urinated on the floor. This controversial subject matter invited comments from readers on both sides of the issue. Finally, the time-space aspect. Niger and Cohen explain that protest performances occur at critical times within a culture's history, which give them meaning. Additionally, performances that combine visual and verbal elements are far more effective. Shabtai accomplished this by publishing his poetry in a unique place, the daily Israeli newspaper, Haaretz. Thus, readers saw a textual as well as visual relationship between themselves and the ongoing political event. After discussing the model, we can apply those ideas to Pavlinsky's performances. First, the diachronic dimension. Acts of self-mutilation are common protests against authoritarian governments, like Tibetan monks who light themselves on fire to protest the oppressive Chinese government. According to the book, protests performed in repression in Khrushchev's Soviet Union, political prisoners would often nail their scrotums to stools as a sign of political desperation. Pavlinsky's fixation, when he attached himself to Moscow's Red Square, references these acts, in both action and location. Moscow's Red Square is important because historically it was a location by military marches by the old, oppressive Soviet government. Additionally, anti-government protests have been occurring there since the mid-60s. Thus, Pavlinsky's fixation fulfills our first tenet. Second, the synchronic dimension. In Pavlinsky's second performance, called Stitch, he sewed his lips shut in July of 2012. This act was a direct reference to the jailing of the Russian punk rock band Pussy Riot. Through physically sewing his lips shut, he metaphorically argues that all Russians are silenced through Putin's restrictions on free speech. This garnered even more international media attention and support for the Free Pussy Riot campaign. Thus, this pointed act fulfills our second tenet. Finally, the dimension of time and space. In Pavlinsky's Carcass, he wrapped himself in barbed wire in front of the Legislative Assembly of St. Petersburg, essentially pointing a finger at the government. In all of Pavlinsky's acts, he clearly fulfills the visual element by showing his body in different kinds of physical pain. For the verbal, he takes a different approach. He remains strategically silent in nearly every performance, thus drawing more attention to the act that he is being arrested for. Thus, this unique combination of the visual and the verbal fulfills our final tenet. After discussing Niger and Cohn's model, and applying those ideas to Pavlinsky's performances, we can return to our research question. How can performance art, as exemplified by Pavlinsky's self-mutilation, be used to counter repression and create a space for dialogue? Pavlinsky's acts work because they combine a historical legacy with ongoing political events, creating a persuasive cultural argument. But there are some limitations to his message. We can discuss this by looking at two implications, on social and methodological levels. First, on a social level, Pavlinsky's use of the visual creates some concerns about the dimensions of time and space. In the model, Niger and Cohn used the example of protest poetry as an easy-to-grasp vehicle for argument. This is because poetry puts the emphasis on message. However, the use of Pavlinsky's body emphasizes spectacle instead of argument. Thus, some of his message got lost. For instance, on November 15, 2013, the Washington Post style blog wrote, "This painful spectacle negates any serious contemplation of the artist's intent." Perhaps if Pavlinsky had used handcuffs, or even a police baton to harm himself, the message would have been clearer. Finally, on a methodological level, the model fails to address the need for a performance to create dialogue. The use of strategic silence in Stitch worked because it related to the ongoing events surrounding the silence in Pussy Riot. But in nearly every other performance, the link wasn't as clear. When explaining fixation in a November 11, 2013 article in Policy Mike, he said, "This can be seen as a metaphor for the apathy, political indifference, and fatalism of contemporary Russian society." But just 3 days later, New York culture blogger Marina Galprina wrote that many fellow artists and commentators believed that Pavlinsky's nailing was a reference to the crucifixion, even though he had denied these claims just a few days earlier. By failing to sustain dialogue, Pavlinsky's acts were incorrectly defined. Today, we have discussed Niger and Cohn's model, applied those ideas to Pavlinsky's performances, and drew two critical implications. It's clear that Pavlinsky's art, no matter if he's harming his skin, lips, or scrotum, is making a political statement. But while these acts may garner attention, they do little to promote the kind of change Russia needs.